Hello?
Hello.
Hey, how are you doing, Sam? Can you see
Great.
us? Great.
Everything good on your end?
Everything is very good. It's good. So I'm just going to introduce you, and then we can go to the talk. And then afterwards, we'll move to questions. And my comrades here, the students, will introduce themselves so you can know who they are and write their phone and stuff like that. So the questions will probably begin with specifically about the talk, and then probably we'll go on to some other subjects. And if you have questions for them specifically, you're also free. So this is Sam Seder. He is a comedian, actor, and now journalist and a radio show host, hosting the Majority Report. I see he's speaking there from Majority Report headquarters. And he will be speaking to us today about the role of the media in the US election. So he's going to speak for about 25, 30 minutes about this subject, and then we're going to open it up to questions. I'll moderate the questions, and then hopefully we'll be able to move into an organic discussion after that. So, Mr. Seder, please take it away.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Gene for this opportunity to talk to you guys. This is very exciting for me. I mean, we've, particularly in the beginning of my career in radio and as a journalist, discussing obviously the Iraq War was a big part of my job, and so it's fascinating to me to have an opportunity to talk to folks in Iraq. Let me just to put things in context, just give you a little more sense of where I'm coming from in the media landscape in the United States. In some respects, my career as a journalist has reflected what's happened in the U.S. media, more broadly speaking, and probably internationally.
Sam, could I just stop you for a second?
Are you getting an echo?
Yeah, we're getting an echo. Would you like to mute one of the
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. How's that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was saying that my career in journalism, in terms of my reach and the role that I played in the U.S. media market, is in some ways analogous to what's happened to the media more broadly in this country. When I grew up, we had 3 major networks and quite a bit of radio, and obviously newspapers around the country. You would have an aggregate of Americans getting their news from the network news feeds on any given evening, and you're talking about tens of millions of people getting the same message every day and the same news every day. This has changed radically over the past 25, 30 years. First with cable television, and then the internet. And so when I started AM talk radio, which is our biggest sort of the medium that has probably the most reach in the country, or did at the time. Something like 98% of Americans own a radio. I was doing a show 7 to 10, 6 p.m. to 9 every night, where we would have a potential of 4 or 5 million people listening. And I think our ratings had us, at times 1 million people listening over the course of a show nationally. New York, L.A., Chicago, some of the major media markets. Now I do a weekend show that reaches a fraction of that, and a daily show that is primarily delivered on the internet as a podcast and live streaming. And so I'm reaching tens of thousands, not even hundreds of thousands. And to a large extent, that dynamic has played out in the media at large, where our media has become more and more fractured, and people are getting their media from sources that reach a smaller number of people. And so, in many respects, in terms of elections in particular, it seems to me, the media's role has diminished somewhat in, I think, its influence on the outcome of elections. I mean, I think political scientists will tell you that a lot of an election is predetermined in many respects, in the sense that what they call fundamentals will dictate. If the economy is going well, then the incumbent tends to win. If there's someone who is aligned with the incumbent, they tend to win if the economy is going well. If it's going poorly, the opposite is true. I mean, but within the margins, there's some influence, and I think to a certain extent, I mean, and this is something that has occurred to me over the course of, in particularly this campaign. I think the media has, and maybe I'm using the term too broadly, but the media has less of an influence in determining the outcome of an election. I mean, I still think it shapes a narrative, but I'm just not sure in the context of a national election, like a presidential election, that it has the level of influence that it might have had 20 years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's had almost the opposite effect in terms of legislation and in terms of like actual governance in some respects. But the best case media role, obviously, I think is true across the world, and that is that the media should function to educate citizens as to the positions of the presidential candidates, I would say any candidate, obviously, to their positions, their records, both in terms of legislatively and in terms of policy, but also to get a sense of, are they consistent with their records? I think the media has a role in vetting individuals just to make sure that there's no glaring issues of dishonesty or of problems with the law or health issues that may impact things. I mean, this is what the media's, in the best case scenario, their role is to fully examine on behalf of the citizenry every aspect of a candidate. What has become somewhat problematic, I think, in this country, and this is largely a function of two major, I guess, policy decisions, and I would add to just sort of endemic in capitalism. But I think that the profit motive in this country and in the context of our media has, to a significant degree, corroded that role. I think the media still performs that role to a certain extent, but there were two major decisions. One was legislative and one was executive. The executive was to get rid of, under the Reagan administration in the mid-'80s, to get rid of what is known as the Fairness Doctrine, where broadcast media, at least in the context of this country, and I think this is broadly speaking, is media that goes out over the airwaves. Now, we have cable now, and so we don't have the same ability, at least within the context of the way our government is structured, to regulate cable media in the way that we do broadcast networks. So we had 3 or 4 major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. Because they went out over the airwaves, and the airways are publicly owned, our Federal Communications Commission could regulate them. Radio also goes out over the airwaves, and therefore the FCC could regulate them. And for a couple of decades at least, following the post-World War II era, we had the FCC would basically say, if you're going to put on any type of political opinion, you need to make sure that you've provided access to your airways to some entity that holds the opposite opinion. Now, this is a messy thing, and it's obviously subjective, and it's difficult to execute. I would argue it's better than the situation in some respects that we have now, but I'll get to that. The second major sort of, I guess this was legislative, that impacted what we see in terms of the profit motive corroding our news today was which was a broader deregulation, the ending of syndication or specific syndication rules in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which basically opened up the floodgates. And so when I was your age, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe I can't quite tell what the age is, but let's just say 20 or 30 years ago, you had news divisions of the broadcast networks were expected to not function at a profit. They were considered things that would just enhance the quality of your brand. So CBS News Department was not expected to turn a profit, or to the extent that they were, it was much less than they would expect for, Big Bang Theory today. I don't know what TV you guys watch. That's a good question to ask me. But so they didn't expect the news departments to earn what the entertainment section. Now that's not the case. There's also a competition today from cable. And what this profit motive tends to do is to dictate really just how far and in what direction the news media will go. It also, I think, diminishes their willingness to tackle a lot of legislative issues, frankly, that might really anger politicians. In this country, local television stations, many of which are owned by these big networks, and the networks themselves receive an extraordinary amount of money from political advertising. I mean, I've seen different figures. This year, it's anticipated that it's going to be around $4.6 to $4.9 billion of revenue is going to come from political advertising. Just in TV alone, to put that in context, that represents, I mean, it's tough to get these figures, but what could be close to a third of their revenue. And if that's the case, it becomes contrary to the interests of these media outlets to argue for things like campaign finance reform, because they are a huge beneficiary of unlimited spending. And I can tell you that the trajectory of these numbers is, somewhere like this in terms of its growth. And it's always been big, but it really is like this at this point because of different Supreme Court rulings that we've had over the past 20, 30 years, and in particular in the last 5 or 6, that this money is just pouring in. And it's tougher to get data in terms of print media and online and digital, but I have no reason to believe that it's any less. So this makes it very difficult, I think, for media outlets to really report on what many people in this country perceive as to be one of the biggest problems that we have with our politics, and that is the corrosiveness of money. I think there's a host of issues like this that we see. We have a very contentious or controversial trade deal that called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there's some subsidiary and sort of related deals that, broadly speaking, the American public, both left and right, are not in favor of for their own specific reasons, but largely corporate America in major industries, one of which actually happens to be Hollywood, are in favor of it because and by Hollywood I mean media affiliated companies, because this trade deal deals with things like copyrights and intellectual property, and so we see very little reporting of this. Now, part of it also could be, and this is also what is sort of problematic with the profit incentive, is that a lot of these things are drier topics. They don't necessarily get you the ratings, and the profit motive becomes overwhelming for people who are trying to basically function in a business of media. And so all of those things lend themselves to two dynamics. One is that we have a population that's not as educated about important issues, and even issues that they care about, than they should be. And the other is that in the context of elections, much of the reporting tends to be like you would see of a sporting event. And the other thing that adds to that element of it being a sporting event, and I say this as someone who, I don't have the same corporate restraints with my daily show. It is completely independent and primarily funded by its listeners. I don't have a ratings compulsion beyond my own ego, which is not insignificant, but is not, ratings are not going to get me fired as long as I have a support from listeners who are interested in something deeper. But I will say that in the context of an election campaign, some of this stuff is low-hanging fruit. It's easier to do. And it means that I can send my kids to school in the morning and make their lunch instead of having to come into the office an extra hour earlier to understand the dynamics of a more complicated issue. And I think that dynamic plays out even more so in our sort of bigger media outlets. And most of our media are bigger media outlets than mine. I work on a part-time basis for a news cable outlet called MSNBC, but I go in and basically pontificate for an hour a week. So it doesn't in any way sort of shape my practical or philosophical perspective. So those are the dynamics I think that are at play. Let me just talk specifically about the election that's going on now, and then I want to make this more of a dialogue. We have a candidate in the Republican race who has sort of been the culmination of almost everything I've talked about this year. I'm sure you're aware of Donald Trump. He has received, and these figures are tough to measure, but I think it's safe to say almost twice as much media coverage as any other candidate in the race, twice as much as the next highest covered candidate, let me say, on either side, Democratic or Republican. of anybody in the race. It has been calculated that he has received $2 billion worth of free media since entering the race in June of last year. This is because of, well, one, he drives ratings. He is an incredible showman, and people who are determined to vote against him are just as compelled to watch as people who are not sure if they want to vote for him or do want to vote for him. He is a show, and he has literally become a television show in and of himself, with a dramatic arc, with subtext and themes that people can pull out of it. And this is not to say that the media should not be covering him, and maybe not even to the extent that he has. I mean, in my mind, it tells a very important story about what's happening to our politics, never mind our media in this country. But this has been the dynamic. And there is at least a complaint and a theory that this enormous amount of media coverage that he's received contributed to his rise in the polls. Now, I should just put that in context, because even though he is likely to be maybe not the Republican nominee, because it's unclear how far the party will go to stop him and as to whether or not he gets the majority of delegates needed. Right now, all the calculations look like he will miss it by just a small amount. And then it will be more of a, a cage match situation. But the number of votes that he will have received in the Republican Party, although it will be the most votes in the Republican Party, will still be less than the loser of the top two candidates in the Democratic Party. So I say this in terms of, so that you get a sense, an understanding that he's not dominating the Republicans. He's just gotten a plurality and what has appeared to be largely an unshakable plurality for numerous reasons. But he has received the beyond overwhelming amount of media coverage. And there are some people who say that his rise is attributable to that. It's possible. I don't think that's the case. I think that's just a function of I think his rise is a function of a large segment of the plurality, or I should say the plurality of the party that he purports to represent. I think if there had been less of him and more of the others, I think that would have just left people craving more of him. Both those that want to see him because they think he's a disaster for the Republicans, and those that want to see him because they're interested in him. There's also a sense that on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders, who is currently in second place to Hillary Clinton, has received an insufficient amount of media coverage that has been warranted based upon his popularity. And I think to a certain extent, there's actually an argument there. Like I say, he's going to finish, and Clinton will too. We don't know who's going to win there. Most people are betting that it's going to be Clinton, but it's unclear at this point. But either way, both of them are going to finish with more votes than Donald Trump. And to a large extent, Democratic voters are looking for something different than Republican voters are. That's just the nature of the parties. And so I think there is an argument that he has not received the amount of coverage that would have been warranted. And I think there's also an argument that he represents a threat more to the media that we rely on to cover him. He is running a campaign that is arguably a single issue. I mean, I think there's more, but his most prominent issue is to get money out of politics and necessarily to diminish a major revenue stream, if not the largest revenue stream for these outlets that are covering him. He also is a direct threat to a lot of the other advertisers on these media outlets. You know, and this is speculation on my part, but this is, I think there's, nothing I'm saying is, and I think, again, the profit motive, I think these media outlets perceive him to be not as low-hanging fruit for ratings. And so I probably should have also said this up front, that on the spectrum of American politics, I am to the left of media outlets, I should say, and commentators and journalists. So I probably should have said that up front so that you get where I'm coming from. But that's basically the scenario that's going on now. I mean, the coverage of the political race is a daily thing. It overwhelms most things, but it also is overwhelming our politics too. So there's not a lot that's happening in the context of politics that isn't, in many respects, very fundamentally influenced by this race. There are other issues that are also fundamentally, we only get one half of the equation, though, generally. The race will fundamentally affect policy and our legislation and our policies going forward. We don't hear as much in depth about those policies and legislation that I think would be healthy for really any country. But again, I think this is a problem with the profit motive, and that's the gist of it. And I'd like to open up to questions. Gene, I don't know what the best way you think to do this would be, but.
Well, I'll open up to questions, and then whoever's asking the question will introduce themselves, let you know who they are, and then give you a question, and we can let it go back and forth like that. Sound good to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so who wants to go with the first one? Introduce yourself and what you study and your question.
Okay, my name is Hajir. I'm an international studies student, and we are very glad to have a conversation with you, and I hope to have a face-to-face discussion in the future. I have 2 or 3 questions. One of them, especially about media in the United States. Our medias are biased or unbiased during the election campaign, because I have seen personally you are more democratic, that you just criticize Donald Trump. So are the medias are unbiased or biased during the election campaign? That's the first one. And the second one, we have heard from some politicians, actually Middle Eastern politicians, said that United States election just a fake election, because 8 years for the Republicans and 8 years for the Democratic, except at the Ronald Reagan's period, that we can see the difference. So what's your opinion about this statement? And I want to know your expectation if the 2 final candidates will be Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. What will be expect for the next United States president? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I hope we have a chance to meet in person as well. I am biased. I definitely am like I said, I come from a left perspective, and I am very upfront with that in the context of my show. My feeling is that I make that clear at the beginning of my show, and if you listen to my show on a regular basis, you're very aware of that. And then I let the work speak for itself. I mean, I do interviews with people, and I think the interviews I think from a journalistic standpoint are perfectly legitimate and are not necessarily. I don't think the interviews show a particular bias per se, but I choose to interview guests who represent policy prescriptions and perspectives that are consistent with my left worldview. I think the media and I think the media at large, I think you can find everything. I think you can find people who are explicitly right wing. I think you can find media outlets that pretend that they're not right wing and are right wing. From my perspective, and I think maybe someone from the right wing would argue otherwise, but from my perspective, most of the explicitly left-leaning outlets in this country, and there's not that many, are explicit about it. Maybe that's circular, but I think our major corporate outlets tend to be liberal socially, but tend to have a very corporate or profit-driven perspective, which may or may not be ideological. For the most part, I don't think our media is ideological. And for the most part, when they are, they're explicit about it. However, I would also argue that if you are a media outlet owned by a major corporation that has a vested interest in certain policies, like a trade deal or like the strengthening of laws that would make it easier for you to make profit out of your intellectual property that you have generated, and that I would argue that is an ideology in and of itself, and your refusal to cover it or just forgetting to is biased. So I'm not convinced that there's anything but biased media. Let's put it that way. And it's really a matter of degree and matter of type. But in terms of cheering for one candidate or another, I don't think there's many outfits that do this without being explicit about it. I think they just want what sells in that moment. And on a presidential level, most of the candidates tend to subscribe to policies that would benefit these major corporations anyways, sadly. But I do think, frankly, I do think there's a little bit of bias against someone like Bernie Sanders, who, again, represents a direct threat to their interests. But how that plays out, I think it's tough to say. Our elections are not fake. There's a lot of things that are problematic about them, but they're not fake. It doesn't go back and forth by any design. There is, I suspect you're going to see a Democrat win this year again. And so it will break that mold that you were talking about. But I think there is a tendency for just society to get sick of one party and then have the other party and then get sick of them and then bring in the other party. I think that's changed. On a national level, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to win a presidential race for an extended period of time. And so I would not be surprised to see a Democrat win this year. And then even in 4 years from now, I would not be surprised to see a Democrat win based upon what I think is happening with the Republican Party. My prediction for the fall, if I had to bet, I would say that Hillary Clinton is going to be the Democratic nominee. I think the Republican nominee, and this could take us down a little bit of a wormhole, but I think the Republican nominee is unlikely to be Donald Trump at this point. I think it's either going to be Donald Trump or it could be someone like Paul Ryan, someone who's not even in the race right now. It's a very, very strange time for Republicans. And I think that they're going to be faced, and I don't know if there's even a they that thinks in this type of cohesion. They're going to be faced with either a disaster electorally or a catastrophe. And I think it's just they're going to have to decide. And I don't know if they're even going to decide as much as sort of there's going to be a default answer. But that's the best I can do with that.
Okay, so who else would like to ask a question? One line?
My name is Lana Jabbar. I work for the university newspaper called AY's Voice. I believe a lot of the candidates are using media, and especially social media, in order to reach a wider audience, but specifically the younger generation. However, we see that even though Bernie Sanders, most of his supporters are from the younger generation, he's not getting as much media coverage as the other candidates. Why do you think we see that? Like, why do you think that happens when? Yeah.
Well, I think when you talk about social media, I mean, he's getting there's a lot of activity. I mean, the coverage isn't there because it's a different type of dynamic. I think part of the reason why he's not getting as much coverage in the context of the more traditional media is that I think a lot of the people who run that media tend to be older, and at the beginning of this campaign did not think it was possible for someone who identified themselves as a democratic socialist or a social democrat as having a chance. I was interviewed at least a couple of times by print journalists around this time last year, maybe a little bit later, who were incredibly dismissive of the idea that Sanders could even be competitive because of his profile. And I think the reason why you would have that perspective, when to me it was so obvious that he was going to be competitive, would be either you are somewhat out of touch with where young people are today, and by young people I mean under the age of 35, or, and maybe this is a similar way of saying this, but I think it's slightly different. You spend so much time with establishment politicians and journalists and whatnot that within the context of that world that you inhabit, it's also, you were completely shut out from understanding why he would do so well. And so I think the media was slow to pick up on it, and I think a lot of those same biases remain. Hillary Clinton was considered to be inevitable, and I think those biases remain. And I think, part of it was polling, and I think, there's also part of it that he scares. I don't know if scares is the right word, but maybe scares is the right word. There is a bias against him because he's basically saying to the people who own a lot of these outlets, they hear that he wants to take their money away. And to a certain extent, in a very rudimentary level, he does. He wants to do that through regulation. He wants to do that through constraining the amount that politicians can spend or can raise. And so to a certain extent, he is, it would be irrational of these corporations to not perceive him as a threat and to say, we should promote him as much as we promote anybody else. Which is unfortunate. I think the growth of social media has. I don't know that we could see Bernie Sanders doing as well as he is if it were not for the growth of social media and the flattening out, if you will, of the media landscape. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips.